Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
There are moments in life that don't arrive with thunder or drama or even the dignity of a proper argument. Some betrayals come gently, wrapped in the softness of normalcy, delivered with the same voice that once read you bedtime stories. It happened on a Saturday morning, the kind of quiet, forgettable day that had no business becoming a turning point. I had driven 3 hours out from the city to visit my parents for the weekend, something I'd done every couple of months since they'd started needing help with things they didn't like to admit they were struggling with: computer issues, retirement paperwork, the occasional car insurance mix-up. I brought groceries like I always did, asked about their health like I always did, and stayed in my childhood bedroom like I always had. Only this time, that room wasn't mine anymore. The first thing I noticed was the dinosaur decals on the wall. I blinked at them, confused, thinking maybe I'd opened the wrong door. But no, the window still faced the same backyard fence. The desk was still the same old wooden one I'd studied at through high school, and the corner still held the faint shadow on the carpet where my bookshelf used to stand. Except now, that desk was piled with blocks and sippy cups, and the dresser where I'd once tucked away my journals had a little white noise machine humming gently on top. I didn't say anything right away. I just stood there, suitcase in hand, as the weight of something I couldn't yet name settled on my chest. Then my mother's voice floated up from the hallway, casual as ever, with the kind of dismissive nonchalance that only comes from long-practiced favoritism. "Oh, you're here. I meant to tell you, we gave your room to Owen. It just makes more sense. You're never here anyway." She said it as if she were talking about rearranging the kitchen cabinets, as if 26 years of my life stored inside that room were as replaceable as a folding chair. I turned slowly, suitcase still dangling from my hand, and looked at her standing there in her cardigan and slippers, arms crossed comfortably across her chest, like this was no big deal, like this was reasonable. I nodded. I nodded because I've always nodded. Because from the time I was old enough to understand how our family worked, I knew that nodding was easier than asking why my needs always came second. I nodded the way I used to when Carrie would throw a tantrum and get my dessert. I nodded the way I did when I paid off Mom and Dad's overdue mortgage loan 3 years ago, and they said thanks like I'd just picked up the mail. I nodded because even though I felt the sting building behind my eyes, I also felt something else, something colder, steadier, older, a quiet finality that curled around my spine and whispered, "You don't have to pretend anymore." I followed my mother downstairs, asking where I should put my bag. "You can sleep on the pull-out," she said, gesturing to the lumpy couch in the den. "It's not so bad if you fold that extra blanket under the mattress. Carrie says it's fine." Of course she does, I thought. Carrie's been making herself comfortable in my absence since I left for college. The truth is, she never really moved out. Even when she got married, briefly, she was back within a year, with a baby on her hip and 1,000 excuses on her tongue. "Things didn't work out," she said. "He didn't support my dreams." And while I quietly climbed the corporate ladder, paid my own rent, and learned to budget down to the cent, Carrie floated through the world with a net underneath her, woven from our parents' blind devotion and her ability to cry on cue. I spent that weekend helping them clear out what was left of my room. My mother handed me boxes marked Natalie, old, and didn't even notice when I paused on the photo of me at my high school graduation, standing in that very doorway, beaming with a medal around my neck. She had Carrie on speakerphone, listening to Owen recite the alphabet, clapping with delight as if he'd just published a novel. My father, true to form, stayed mostly quiet, occasionally offering to carry this to the garage or tape up that box, like a man who had long ago accepted that emotional labor was not in his contract. At one point, Carrie FaceTimed us, and my mother turned the phone toward me, saying, "Look who's here. Nat's helping with the room. Isn't that sweet?" Carrie just smirked, lounging comfortably in what used to be my bed, her son bouncing beside her, sticky hands smearing the headboard. "Thanks, sis," she said with a wink. "You've always been the helpful one." I don't know how I didn't scream. Instead, I kept packing. I folded old t-shirts I hadn't worn in decades. I gently wrapped my 8th grade science fair trophy in bubble wrap. I stacked my childhood into cardboard and carried it out, one piece at a time, while my mother pointed out how great the new nightlight looked in Owen's room. That night, lying on the pullout in the cold basement, I stared at the ceiling and ran through every moment in my life where I had bitten my tongue, every sacrifice I'd made, every holiday I had spent budgeting their Christmas gifts, while Carrie handed out IOUs. I remembered how they once forgot to invite me to Thanksgiving when Carrie had a meltdown and decided she needed a quiet family dinner. I remembered how, when I paid to fix their roof leak 2 summers ago, my mother said, "You're such a good daughter," but couldn't recall the name of my company when introducing me to her friends. I stared into the dark and listened to the old furnace hum, and I thought, I own this furnace. I remembered the papers I'd signed, the ones that bailed them out when they nearly lost the house. I remembered the email from the mortgage broker congratulating me on majority ownership. And I realized in that moment that while they had spent years treating me like a visitor in their lives, I had quietly become the one thing they never noticed until it was too late. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply waited. Because the difference between me and Carrie? I don't ask for rooms anymore. I take houses. They've always said it like a compliment, those words. You're the strong one. But the older I got, the more I began to understand that what they really meant was something else entirely. It wasn't praise. It wasn't admiration. It was permission. Permission to neglect me. Permission to rely on me without guilt. Permission to excuse the absence of comfort, of attention, of effort. Because I was strong and strength, in their minds, meant I didn't need anything. I was self-cleaning, self-funding, self-soothing. And Carrie, poor, messy, scattered Carrie, was the one they had to love out loud. Because she needed it, and I didn't. That was the story they built brick by brick, and they never questioned if maybe I needed something too. I spent most of my 20s trying not to let it bother me. I buried myself in work, convinced myself I was fine, even lucky. I lived in quiet, stylish apartments. I built my career like it was armor. I mastered the art of doing everything myself. Not just the groceries and the bills and the dentist appointments, but the emotional labor too. I was the one who called to check in, who sent thoughtful birthday cards, who kept her opinions to herself when Carrie brought home her latest half-finished dream and asked for praise like a child tap dancing for quarters. I learned to say I'm fine so convincingly that even I almost believed it. But it's exhausting, being the one who doesn't make waves. There's a kind of loneliness in being the reliable one that people don't talk about. Because when your phone doesn't ring, when no one asks how you're doing, when no one notices that you've been quiet or distant or a little more tired than usual, you don't get to be upset. Because you're strong. You're not supposed to need anything. I could give you 100 examples of how that story played out in my family, but there's one that always comes back to me. It was 5 years ago, and Carrie had just gone through her second separation. This time with a musician who had forgotten to mention he had a second family in Nevada. She came home crying, wearing a leopard print coat and no shoes, dragging a suitcase with a broken wheel. She collapsed on the living room floor like a wet blanket and sobbed into the couch cushion while my mother fluttered around her like a nurse in a war zone. She made tea. She brought warm towels. She held her head in her lap like she was cradling something holy. And me? I was in the kitchen making dinner because they forgot to eat. I remember hearing Carrie wail that she had nowhere else to go, and my mother whispering, "It's okay, baby. You're safe here. We'll figure it out." That was the night she moved back in with Owen, who was just a toddler then, and my father muttered something about how the house always had room for family. But when I called 2 weeks later to say I might be coming for the weekend, just to visit, just to breathe, my mother's tone shifted. "Well, things are a little crowded right now," she said carefully. "Carrie and Owen are still adjusting. Maybe next month?" I didn't say anything. I just said okay. And when I did come home the next month, there was a crib in my bedroom. No one warned me. No one asked if I minded. It just appeared, like it belonged more than I did. They kept saying I was strong. That weekend, as I sat on the pull-out sofa with a glass of wine balanced on a stack of Real Simple magazines, Carrie flopped down beside me with a half-eaten granola bar and said, "I always admired you. You've got your life together and everything. I don't know how you do it." She said it like it was a compliment, but the way she said together made it sound like a diagnosis. Like I was emotionally sterile. Like functioning was a form of emotional failure. I looked at her with her sleep-deprived eyes and impulsive tattoos and the ever-present cloud of some new passion project waiting to fail. And I realized she didn't actually envy me. She pitied me, because in our family, being chaotic earned you attention. Being solid just made you invisible. And then she laughed, wiped Owen's nose with the hem of her shirt, and said, "Anyway, Mom says you don't mind. You've always been the strong one." I stared at the television, trying not to let it show on my face. That was the moment I started thinking differently, not in a cruel way, not yet, but in a practical way. I started thinking about ownership, not just of houses or loans or finances, but of story, of space, of truth. I started going back through my old emails, rereading the mortgage documents I'd signed during their refinance crisis, noticing things I hadn't thought about the first time, percentages, titles, leverage. I hadn't cared then. I just wanted to help. But now I had started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Resentment sharpened into intention. That night, after they all went to bed, I wandered upstairs and opened the door to what used to be my bedroom. The dinosaur decals were still there, and the nightlight glowed faintly in the corner. A pile of Owen's picture books sat where my yearbooks used to be. I stood in the doorway, hands in my pockets, and thought, this room doesn't belong to me anymore, but the house does. I walked down the hallway, my fingers tracing the chipped paint on the banister, and I realized something even more important. They don't see me, but I see everything, and I remember everything too. There's a moment just before a decision is made when everything becomes unnaturally still, like the world itself knows something irreversible is about to take root. I felt that quiet hum of inevitability the morning I opened the email from the bank that began, "As majority lien holder, you retain full discretion over the mortgage agreement terms." The sentence was clinical, harmless even, on the surface, but I stared at it for several minutes, rereading it, letting each word settle into place, like pieces in a puzzle I didn't realize I'd been assembling for years. It wasn't sudden. This moment had been building, layer by invisible layer, from the time I was old enough to understand that fairness and family didn't always go hand in hand. The documents I'd signed 3 years earlier were the result of a familiar family pattern. Carrie had made another impulsive life decision, this time quitting her part-time job to pursue something involving handmade jewelry and eco-healing retreats. And the financial ripple hit my parents like a brick through glass. They didn't say she caused it, of course. They framed it as bad timing, high taxes, the economy. They always had a way of cleaning up her chaos with words that softened the truth just enough to be palatable. But the numbers didn't lie. They were going to lose the house. And despite everything, despite the birthday dinners missed, the calls ignored, the space I was pushed out of again and again, I stepped in. I didn't hesitate. I told them calmly and without drama, "Let me help you." I was the one who read through the fine print, who sat on hold with the bank, who offered to shoulder the bulk of the refinancing if it meant keeping the house out of foreclosure. My father had gripped my hand and said, "We're so lucky to have a daughter like you." And my mother had kissed my cheek, murmuring, "We'll never forget this." I think she believed that when she said it. I think she meant it for about a month, maybe 2, until things settled, until the threat passed, until Carrie had a new idea, and the attention swung back to her again. Then the memory of what I did became soft, vague, buried beneath Owen's birthday parties and Carrie's never-ending reinventions. I never brought it up. Not once. I didn't hang it over their heads, didn't mention it at Christmas, didn't sigh about it when the house needed new plumbing and they called me again. I just paid, quietly, like always. I told myself I was doing it out of love, out of duty, out of the hope that one day something would shift and they would see me not just as the strong one, the helper, the fixer, but as a person who deserved space and regard and basic consideration. But sitting there, With that email open in front of me, I realized I had been wrong. They weren't going to see me. Not really, not ever. Because I had made it too easy not to. They didn't forget what I did for them. They just believed they were entitled to it. Entitled to my money, my silence, my room. And somewhere along the way, they had become so accustomed to my absence of resistance that they mistook it for agreement. Or worse, for consent. Later that day, I walked through the neighborhood, trying to gather my thoughts. It was a quiet suburb lined with tidy hedges and identical mailboxes. The kind of place where families had block parties and arguments about lawn care. I had grown up there, riding my bike past the same corner I now passed as an adult, and I realized how much I had internalized the idea that this home, this street, this identity they gave me, obedient daughter, responsible sister, was fixed and permanent. But nothing is permanent, not really, and certainly not the illusion that they could give a take and take without consequence. Back at my apartment, I opened the folder where I had saved the original mortgage documents, the deed, the agreements with the bank. My name was there, in bold, where it mattered. I had asked for nothing in return. No recognition, no control, not even a key to the office where they kept financial paperwork. But now, something had shifted. Not just the facts, but the frame around them. I hadn't wanted control, but I had it. And what I chose to do with it would define everything that came next. I called my attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Celeste, who had helped me through my first property investment. I trusted her because she didn't flinch when I asked tough questions, and because she never tried to dress things up with false optimism. When she answered, I didn't give her the long story. I didn't explain the history. I simply asked, if I wanted to take full control of the house, how difficult would that be? There was a pause, a shift in her tone, just barely detectable. Legally, not difficult at all, she said. Emotionally, that's another conversation. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there for a long time with my phone in my hand. The silence in the room felt different now, not empty, but loaded, like a fuse waiting to be lit. And the truth was, I didn't feel angry, not in the screaming, wild way people think revenge is born. What I felt was clarity, a pure, crystalline awareness that no one else was going to protect my place in that family. Not my mother, not my father, not even my sister, who had long ago decided that her chaos was more valuable than my peace. The difference now was that I had a choice, and I was finally ready to make it. There's something oddly quiet about the way consequences unfold when they've been planned with precision and patience, rather than passion or spite. It doesn't come with shouting or slammed doors, and no one throws plates or delivers screaming monologues on the front lawn like in a bad soap opera. No, when you spend years being the one who holds your tongue, who gives more than she gets, who watches from the sidelines while others soak up attention they didn't earn, your version of revenge arrives dressed like silence. It comes in the form of carefully worded legal notices, of signatures inked in quiet offices, of long overdue decisions delivered without apology. The letter went out on a Tuesday. It was simple, clinical, professionally written, the kind of correspondence that's been stripped of emotion by layers of legal protocol and courtesy. It didn't say anything cruel. It didn't need to. It was just a notice of property transfer and intent to vacate. According to the terms of the revised agreement, an agreement they had signed and notarized without ever reading too closely, because I had always been the daughter who handled the paperwork. They had 30 days to leave the property. The house, my childhood home, the place they had claimed as theirs, with unwavering entitlement, now belonged entirely to me. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, legally, unequivocally. I didn't hear from them the first day, or the second. I imagined the letter sitting in a neat pile of mail on the hallway table, unopened until just before dinner, when my mother sorted through coupons and grocery receipts. I imagined her brow furrowing as she read it, then rereading it, then calling my father into the room with that clipped, urgent tone she always used when something wasn't going the way she expected. I imagined Carrie's voice on speakerphone 10 minutes later, already loud and defensive, saying things like, "This must be some mistake," or "There's no way Natalie would do this." And then, inevitably, she's just being dramatic. But on the third day, my phone rang. It was my mother, and I let it ring until it stopped. Then it rang again, and again. She left a voicemail the fifth time. Her voice was thin and shaking at the edges, threaded through with disbelief and panic in equal measure. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask what had happened. She just kept saying, "Natalie, call me back, please. This can't be real. We need to talk. You don't have to do this." But I did. I absolutely did. Later that night, Carrie called. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Her voice came through the speaker like a slap, full of that same old bravado she always put on when she thought she was protecting her place at the center of the story. "What the hell is this?" she snapped. "You sent them an eviction notice? Are you serious? Do you have any idea what this is doing to Mom? To Owen? He thinks he's being kicked out of his home." I didn't respond. I just listened, because I had nothing to say that she would hear. "You can't be this cruel," she continued. "You're not like this. You're the strong one, remember? The good daughter, the one who helps." That word again. Help. They had turned it into a leash so long ago I forgot I was wearing it. But now, for the first time, I wasn't just tugging back. I had slipped out of it entirely. Carrie's voice cracked then, dropping from attack into a kind of whimpering confusion. "If this is about the room, Natalie, I mean, God, we didn't know you felt that way. You never said anything. You should have just told us." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. The idea that the burden of clarity had always been mine. That I should have spelled out the pain, the patterns, the way I had been slowly erased from my own family, until all that was left of me was my ability to pay for things. That I should have performed my suffering in a way that made them comfortable enough to acknowledge it. They had never listened before. Why would now be different? By the end of the week, my father sent a short message, typed neatly, almost painfully polite. It said, "We're very confused. We'd appreciate a conversation before any further steps are taken." I deleted it. Not out of cruelty, out of preservation. The thing people never understand about quiet people is that we don't act out of impulse. We act when we're done, when we've turned over every possibility in our minds, when we've tried empathy, tried patience, tried every possible path toward peace, and all of them led back to silence. That's when the door shuts, not with fury, but with finality. I did not gloat. I did not drive past the house or stalk their social media pages for updates. I did not look for photos of Owen packing up his things or wonder how Carrie would spin this to her friends. I did not think about what they would say to the neighbors. That wasn't my problem anymore. What I did do was start packing my own things. From my small city apartment, slowly, deliberately. I had plans to move into the house, not out of nostalgia, but because it was mine now, not emotionally, not figuratively, in every legal and binding sense, and I was going to treat it like mine. I wasn't sure what I would do with the dinosaur decals or Owen's art supplies. I wasn't sure what to do with the spare room that used to be mine, now filled with forgotten toys and stains on the carpet. But I knew I would repaint it. I knew I would clear it. I knew I would reclaim it, not for the girl who once lived there, but for the woman who had learned, at long last, that her silence could build something stronger than all the noise in the world. They still called, not every day, but often enough to make it clear that the pain had finally caught up with them. I saved the voicemails. I didn't delete them, but I never hit play, because this wasn't what it looked like. It wasn't vengeance. It was ownership of the house, of the story, of myself. There's a specific kind of quiet that only belongs to an emptied house, the kind of silence that doesn't simply fill the space, but settles deep into the walls and floorboards as if it's been waiting for its moment to stretch out and breathe freely. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, keys clicking with a finality that only I understood, I could feel that silence like a living thing, a patient presence that had endured decades of noise, tension, and half-truths. The house was still the same shape, still the same brick facade with the overgrown hedge and the cracked driveway we never fixed. But it didn't feel the same. It no longer pulsed with that tightly wound energy of performance, where every family gathering was laced with polite lies and a fragile peace that could be shattered by something as small as a misplaced tone or an honest question. Now it felt hollow in a way that wasn't sad, just different, just honest. The moving truck had come and gone the day before. I hadn't been there when they packed. I didn't need to be. I knew my mother would have taken her time, wrapping each ceramic angel figurine in tissue paper, probably whispering to them like old friends. I knew my father would have done all the heavy lifting without complaint, sweat rolling down his back while he pretended not to be confused or hurt or angry. I knew Carrie would have been dramatic in ways both expected and self-serving, sighing loudly, talking on the phone, making sure someone was always watching her suffer. I imagined Owen just watching them all, too young to understand the nuances, but old enough to feel the shift. I didn't envy him the weight of that memory, years down the line, when he'd ask why his aunt had made them leave the house they once called home. I didn't have an answer he'd understand, not yet, maybe not ever. I stood in the entryway and let my eyes wander, letting each object, each smudge on the wall, each creak of the hardwood under my feet, wash over me without nostalgia. The framed family photo was gone from the stairwell, the one from when I was 12 and Carrie was 8. Both of us dressed in matching floral dresses that we hated, but smiled through because our mother said it made us look like sisters who got along. The carpet still bore the faint wine stain from the New Year's Eve party. No one talked about anymore. The one where Dad drank too much and Mom cried in the kitchen for reasons she would later blame on the weather. Even stripped of its furniture and personal touches, the house was still full of ghosts. Ghosts of conversations unfinished, apologies never offered, small betrayals brushed under the rug in the name of keeping the peace. I walked from room to room, not to inspect, but to feel. I passed the kitchen where I once stood washing dishes, while my mother raved about Carrie's latest job interview, never asking how my week had gone. I stood in the hallway where I'd listened through the thin walls as they reassured Carrie, again and again, that her mistakes didn't define her, that she was loved no matter what. I had believed that once, believed that love meant forgiveness, meant space, meant inclusion. But I had learned that in some families, love is conditional, and those conditions are hidden behind the mask of tradition and habit and quiet favoritism. I had met every expectation they placed on me. I had achieved, I had paid, I had been responsible, and in return, I had been told that I was strong, that I didn't need as much, that I would understand. They called it trust. What it really was, Padpads, was neglect. Politely dressed. I reached what used to be my room, the room that had most recently belonged to Owen, and opened the door slowly. The dinosaur stickers were still there, curling at the edges now, and the faint smell of baby wipes lingered in the air, oddly sterile. The curtains were drawn and light filtered through them in pale streaks, casting long shadows over the carpet. There were a few forgotten toys under the dresser, a bent crayon, a tiny plastic figure missing an arm. I crouched to pick them up, not out of sentimentality, but because I didn't want them there anymore. I was taking the room back. Not the way it was, not with the innocence it once held, but as a blank space, something new, something mine. I spent the next few days painting the walls a soft, deep blue, a color I had always loved, but had never been allowed to choose as a child. Back then, my mother had insisted on pastels, said they were feminine and light, and that strong colors were too much for a little girl's room. I painted carefully, slowly, letting each stroke erase the stories they had written over my space. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about grief. It was about writing something new, something quiet and deliberate and mine. I furnished the room with a desk, a comfortable reading chair, and shelves for books I had never had space to store. I moved my things in gradually. Nothing flashy, just the essentials, chosen carefully. I didn't want to fill the space too quickly. I wanted to let it breathe. Some nights I would sit in that chair with a glass of wine and listen to the quiet, No footsteps. No Carrie shouting into the phone. No passive-aggressive comments from my mother floating down the hallway. Just silence. Not empty, but peaceful. And in that peace, I began to understand something I hadn't before. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about justice. Not in the clean, cinematic way people crave when they hear a story like this. It was about boundary, about ending the cycle of erasure, about refusing to be treated like furniture, present, useful, invisible. The phone still rang sometimes. My mother would leave voicemails that started strong and ended in quiet sobs. My father texted occasionally, vague messages like, "Hope you're well," or "Miss seeing you." Carrie had gone silent after a flurry of texts full of insults, pleas, and then silence when none of it worked. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I had said everything I needed to say in the only language they had ever truly listened to, ownership. I played one voicemail once, a week after I moved in. My mother's voice trembled as she said, "You've broken this family, Natalie. I don't understand why you're doing this. Please, just talk to me. We can fix it." But it was never mine to fix. It never had been. I deleted the message and placed the phone face down on the table. Then I stood, walked to the front door, and opened it, not for anyone, but for myself. I stepped outside and took a long breath, feeling the air move through me, light and clean and mine. Because the house was quiet now, and I finally was too.